this series, Running with the Giants, and I want you all to know that I picked a character that his story is so long that it takes an entire book of the Bible to tell it, so we're going to be here all afternoon. You can cancel your lunch plans. We are fasting today. Just kidding. Well, actually, I was thinking about this series, and that I'm aware of, nobody has actually talked about running. So let's talk about running for a second. I have a confession to make. Some of you who have gotten to know me fairly well know that I am not very athletic at all. I try to be. I say that I cheer for the Cowboys and the Twins, but if I'm being completely honest, I probably couldn't name more than 2 people on any of those teams. And when it comes to actually playing sports, I have very little hand-eye coordination, and I'm much better if I have a game controller in my hands or a trumpet. In fact, this week I almost ran my bike into a fire hydrant. Oops. So anyways, running. A couple months ago, my friend talked me into signing up for this Wonder Woman race in Fargo. And initially I thought, no way, who does this for fun? I hate running. It reminds me of all of the tests that I had to take in PE that I was terrible at in high school. And, then I started to think about it, and I thought, this would probably be a good thing for me to do. It's healthy for me. It'd be a good goal if I can live to cross the finish line. That's the main thing. So I signed up, and this is why we say no to peer pressure, kids. Friends, do not let friends run for fun. Oh. So I trained, and I started running, and I started to realize that every single choice that I make was affecting how my body was performing, what I ate, how much sleep I got, if I stretched or not, what kind of music I listened to, what the weather was like. And there was so much training and perseverance that went into it, and it was really hard work. I just wanted Dairy Queen the whole time. So then the day of the race came, and I had my Wonder Woman tutu on to match the theme, and somebody told me that I should have worn it today while I was preaching, and so I told them that I wanted to keep my job. So I got up to the starting line, and they shot the gun thingy, and I went off into the streets of Fargo. And my first thought was, as I was moving my legs, what in the world have I gotten myself into? I hate running, and I paid $100 to do this to myself. I'm an idiot. It was terrible. And on top of that, I had to use the bathroom. But, it was too late to back out. I was swarmed on all sides of me by all of these ladies that had their game face on and their iPod in their ears listening, and I thought, you know what? I'm in this race. There's nowhere I can go but forward. I had to finish what I started. And then there are these wonderful and both dreadful things that appear during the race, and they're called mile markers. They appear as just these giant flags on the side of the road so you know how far you've gone. And they make you both go, yes, 1 mile done! And both, that was only 1 mile! No! And so, speaking of, I don't understand why they marked them as miles on this 5K. It would have been a whole lot cooler if they put 5 flags marking the kilometers instead of 3. Help a girl out. Let me know that I've accomplished more by letting me pass 5 flags instead of 3. But no, just these 3 measly mile markers. Ridiculous. So then finally, after what seemed like an eternity of sweat, heavy breathing, and miserable exhaustion, the finish line was finally near in sight. And all of the misery and the thoughts of stopping disappeared, and they were replaced by this utter joy. In fact, if you want to put that picture up there, this is what it feels like to cross the finish line. Yeah. There's a crowd cheering for you as you cross. You're rewarded with chocolate and Doritos and lots of high-calorie snacks. And then there's a lively band playing in the background to celebrate. And then you literally go take a nap wherever you crash. So in that moment of celebration, I have another confession. I got hooked. I would do that all over again. Even after that race, running is not on my top 10 things to do when I'm bored list. But I would do all of that again, go through the pain in my body, the psychological battles of how much I hate running, just to experience the joy that comes at the end. And so this morning I want to talk about a man from the Old Testament who was not a runner. In fact, he wasn't even an athlete. This is my kind of person. But he did exhibit a life of discipline and perseverance that we can learn from and model. His whole life exemplified that of an athlete in training towards one goal and one purpose. And from start to finish, Daniel ran a race of consistently pressing into God. So you can go ahead and open your Bibles to the book of Daniel, because I'm going to be jumping through a lot of scripture today, and you can follow along with me there. And we're going to hop around to different chapters, and I'll highlight a few passages as we get there. So while you're turning there, let's just dig into his background a little bit. Daniel was not a commoner. He was not a shepherd. He was not a fisherman. He was born of noble blood, and he was related to King Zedekiah. Daniel was born during King Josiah's reign. So that means he grew up during the king's reforms and experienced the kingdom returning back to God as they are destroying idols and destroying pagan altars. And then he also experienced Judah's downfall again as wicked kings inherited the throne. Which means that when it was time for God to judge the kingdom of Judah and allow a pagan nation to conquer it, Daniel experienced that too. Babylon was the pagan nation that conquered Judah, and it was the most powerful empire in the world at that time. Whenever Babylonians invaded a nation, they would carefully select who they would take into exile and who they would leave in this conquered, torn apart country. And so they chose to leave the poor and the uneducated because it would be difficult for them to gather together and try to revolt, and they would be grateful for any sort of mediocre patronage that Babylon would give them. Then the educated, the wealthy, and the strong, they were taken into captivity so that they could, one, be closely watched or imprisoned in case they did try to revolt, or two, if they were young and capable, they would be trained at a young age to serve as officials in Babylon. So it was kind of a win-win for Babylon. The weak learned to love them, and the strong were taught to become like them. So no wonder Babylon was so strong in its day. So Daniel was among one of the first group of captives who were taken from their home in Jerusalem to Babylon. Now, why would they take Daniel again? He was very young, he was very smart, he was of noble blood, which meant that he would be moldable and teachable and capable of navigating all of the politics and the high society etiquette. When they took him from his home, they changed his name, changed his language, gave him a new education, and then they tried to even change his diet and tried to change his religion. But those last two, it didn't work on him. It was in that moment that he realized, I'm in this, I can't go back, I can't stop this from happening. I'm literally surrounded. So whatever happens to me now, the only thing that I can do is to go forward. He knew that if he was going to survive in this new environment, he'd have to adapt. He'd have to learn their ways, excel in his work, serve well and honorably, but most importantly, he had to maintain his integrity. He had to keep moving forward, but he had to hold on to his core identity and what he believed in. So you could say that Daniel encountered that each trial that Daniel encountered in Babylon was like a mile marker or a checkpoint in his race. The key moment where his faith and his integrity were tested. So would he give in to the pressure around him, or would he rise and find that his character had been refined? So that's what I want to take a look at today. We're going to run a virtual 5K with Daniel. And since a 5K is 3 miles, we're going to take a look at 3 major mile markers or trials in his life. What can we learn from his responses in each trial, and how can we have the same resolve that he had in his race and use that in our own? So now all of my fellow unathletic friends, today we get to run a 5K without actually leaving our seats. This is a good day. All right, so let's take a look at mile marker number 1, and this takes place in chapter 2. So let me describe to you the situation. Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm going to just call him Neb for now, was the king at the time that Daniel was brought to Babylon and in training to serve the king. So Neb is a powerful king. He brought Babylon to the height of its power and was known to be unstoppable. If you were a neighboring nation and he had eyes on you, there was nothing you could do about it. You were going down. It was like if Chuck Norris or Darth Vader or Thanos came to visit you. You just know that you are toast, and there's nothing that you can do about it. Neb is also known to be extremely temperamental. If something doesn't go his way, he is known to have one nasty temper. Not too different from the Incredible Hulk, except he doesn't turn green. So not too long after Daniel arrived in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar had some really vivid dreams. He was troubled, they kept him up at night, and ancient culture placed this really high value on the meaning and the symbolism of dreams, especially if it was one that was reoccurring. And for King Neb, this one was reoccurring. And so now we have a grumpy king who has this dream that's upsetting him and confusing him. Oh, and on top of that, now he's sleep deprived too. Yay! That is not a good mix to have. Have you ever been around anybody that's been sleep deprived? Growing up, that was my sister. I adore her and I love her, but it was a known rule in our house that if you tried to wake Macy up and speak to her before noon, you were headed for trouble. It was easier to talk to a grizzly bear than it was to talk to Macy before she was fully awake. So Macy, if you're listening to this someday, I hope you know that I love you and that you don't share any embarrassing stories about me, because there are many. Okay, let's continue. So Nebuchadnezzar is upset and puzzled by this particular dream, and he orders all of his magicians and his wise men to come in and interpret the dream for him. He wants them to tell him why this dream is so significant and also what he's supposed to do about it. But there's a little bit of a catch. He's not going to tell them what the dream was. In fact, they have to guess both the dream and what it means. When they're baffled by this and say that it's humanly impossible to do what he asks, the king is thrown into an even deeper rage, and he orders that the magicians and wise men be literally cut to pieces and their houses are going to be burned down. That escalated really quickly. So since Daniel was considered part of this advising class, his head was on the chopping block too. Men went to go look for Daniel to execute him, and let's read how he responded in verses 14 through 23. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men from Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king." Now at this first mile marker, Daniel is experiencing the pressure to perform. The king needs a task done, and if Daniel doesn't do it, Daniel dies. Pretty simple, incredibly scary and humanly impossible, but a relatively simple idea. And what I love about this passage is the calm resolve that Daniel displays. When there's an angry king that's about to kill me, my first response is not, "Hey, let's go visit him. Maybe I can change his mood and beg for more time." But that's what Daniel did. He had a daring plan. He knew that he could not interpret the dream, but God could. So he gathered his friends and they dug deeply into God's presence. They spent the night in prayer, asking God that his mercy would fall upon them so that God might be glorified in the situation. They didn't call down curses on the king. They didn't run away. They didn't yell at God for bringing them to Babylon. Instead, they asked God to be glorified. Then the next morning, Daniel went in to see the king and pleaded for the lives of the wise men. To the king's astonishment, and I'm sure his jaw literally dropped at this moment, Daniel correctly described every minute detail of the dream, and not only that, he also proceeded to correctly interpret what the dream meant. He performs the task that the king asks of him, but he gives all of the credit back to God. Only God could interpret the dream, and as a result, the king fell on his knees and praised God and also honored Daniel by placing him in a high position and giving him lots of gifts. So Daniel passed mile marker number 1 with flying colors because he pressed into God. When faced with the pressure to do something that he was not strong enough to do, he prayed. He allowed God to be his source of strength, and God responded by doing something miraculous through Daniel. But unfortunately, life didn't get easier for him from there. The race was still on. He still had to move forward. So pressing the fast forward button a little bit, time passes by, government changes, leadership shifts, and now years later we find Daniel much older and more experienced. So we're at mile marker 2 now, and he's approximately 80, 90 years old, and he serves as King Darius's advisors, one of the top 3 advisors. And so the way that this worked was, if you could imagine for a second, that instead of having Congress or the Supreme Court, let's pretend that we have just one American king, okay? Beneath him are 3 advisors. Those 3 advisors have direct control over each of the governors that govern the U.S. states. And then those 3 administrators report back to the king and execute his orders in those provinces or those states. That's kind of what the situation is like. So Daniel has an incredible amount of power at this time. But the cool thing is that it didn't go to his head. Chapter 6 says that he distinguished himself among the administrators and showed exceptional leadership and honesty. Daniel was the goody two-shoes of the bunch. In fact, he showed so much integrity that it irritated the snot out of his colleagues. They were so upset by him. So much so that they saw him as the teacher's pet, and they wanted to tear him down. They wanted to destroy that relationship that he had with the king and take away his power. But none of them could find even an ounce of corruption in him. From their perspective, he was perfect. Now, from our point of view, we know that he was not perfect, that he was only human, but he led a life that so closely followed the Lord that they couldn't find anything to accuse him of. In fact, their only hope of successfully tearing him down would be to go after his beliefs. If they could use Daniel's faithfulness against him and drive a wedge between him and the king, then they could win. So that's what they did. Daniel's colleagues tricked the king into passing a law that required that all subjects pray to King Darius alone. In fact, anyone found praying to anyone other than the king would be thrown into a lion's den. And this does not mean that you get to meet Simba or Mufasa or Aslan. Instead, you become the meat for these ferocious beasts. You are the main entree. The king agreed that this was a good idea to see who was loyal and who was not, and so he went ahead and signed the decree into writing without even hesitating. Now, when Daniel heard of the king's decree, he had a choice that he had to make. He could hide his faith and be a silent believer for 30 days and then ask the Lord for forgiveness later. He could renounce his faith entirely and worship Darius with his prayers. He could have lashed back and sought revenge for what his colleagues did to him. Or he could have panicked and lashed out at God for allowing this to even be passed in the first place. But here at mile marker number 2, it would be Daniel's faith that's tested. Would he follow the pressure of changing loyalties, or would he remain steadfast in the trial? So this is how Daniel responded. You can look at chapter 6, verse 10. It says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." When Daniel went home, he didn't even try to hide. He didn't change a single thing about the way he prayed to the Lord. He stayed committed, just as he had done before. And he went up to this upper room, and it was known as an aliyah. That was the name of it. And it was a room that was usually really well furnished because they used it as a place to welcome honored guests, to have great hospitality. And the windows of these rooms were usually made of this crisscross lattice work, and they'd swing open like doors. And the reason they made them like this was so that if you were on the inside, you could still see out at what was happening, but it was thick enough that it wouldn't let in direct sunlight, so it kept it cool, and it also would still let in a draft. So Daniel didn't open the windows because he was hot, and he certainly didn't open the windows because he couldn't see outside. So perhaps there's a different reason why he opened them. It's almost as if he's swinging wide the windows of his house, his heart, and his life and saying, "Here I am. You can have all of me. God, nothing will stop me from serving you. Come in. Be the honored guest in my house and in my life. You can have my life if you ask it of me. If you ask me to die for me, I'll die for you. I will do it. Let them see me worship you at least one last time." So long story short, at mile marker number 2, there are consequences for Daniel's actions. He was arrested. He was thrown into the lion's den to be eaten alive. But God did something miraculous. He shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel survived. The next morning, the king rushed to the den to see what had happened to one of his favorite advisors, and he was rejoicing that Daniel was still alive. Darius saw God move through Daniel's life and honored Daniel while praising God as the one true God. So Daniel experienced pressure in his faith, and in the midst of that, he chose to press into God. His response, again, the second time, was to pray. He chose to run into God's arms instead of run literally for his life, and he chose to keep his faith grounded in what he firmly knew was right. And because of that, God was glorified. So you guys sensing a theme yet? Are your legs getting sore at all? No? We could switch it to a marathon. 2 more hours? That sound good? Just kidding. I'm not that mean. Okay. We're on the home stretch, and we're coming up on mile marker number 3 now. So here we go. Daniel's third trial was a little bit different than all the rest. It had nothing to do with outside pressure. It had nothing to do with his home or his skills or his faith. It was this internal struggle and something that we all deal with today. It's the unknown. It's the future. So let's take a look at what happened. And this occurs in chapter 10, verse 1 through 3, and you can read along with me. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was also called Belshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. So Daniel receives this vision. In it, he sees fragment of the future, this great war, pain, suffering, death, and he's troubled by it, and rightly so. War is scary. And like all of humanity, he fears this future that he literally has no control over. And I'm sure his mind was racing with these what ifs of what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to my family, the king, Israel, Babylon, all of this stuff. And he's in agony over what he sees, and he mourns and fasts for 3 whole weeks. And then in verse 12, an angel from the Lord appeared to Daniel, and after those 3 weeks he says, "Don't be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them." So we learn from this passage that even though Daniel is battling this internal turmoil and is cut to the heart by this vision, he was spending those 3 weeks in prayer. He resolved to dig deep in prayer and posture himself humbly before God as he asked the Lord to help him understand what he saw. The answer didn't come right away, but it did. Think about this for a second. Can you imagine if Daniel would have responded differently? If he would have said, you know what, God, I'm done. I don't care. You can keep your future. I don't want anything to do with it. You know what? Destroy the wicked, do what you want, build kingdoms or tear them down. I literally don't care. Just leave me out of it. Or what if he had decided to take matters into his own hands and try to change the vision that he was given? What if this was the last straw after all of the trials that he faced and he decided, you know what? God, I'm done. You be you, I'll be me. We could get into all of the little details of the prophecy and try to guess what it meant and what it symbolized, but if we did, we'd be missing the big picture here. So here's what I want you to take away from mile marker number 3. Daniel saw a vision of the future. He was terrified by what he saw, but in the midst of his fear, he chose prayer. He chose to seek God's will and his wisdom concerning the future. In short, he chose to keep the future in God's hands and trust him with it. He chose to press into God instead of allowing his fears to conquer him and consume him. He didn't ask for all the answers, and he didn't ask for the rest of the picture. It wasn't about treating God like a vending machine to get the answer that he wanted. It was about allowing God to be God, and Daniel did this by positioning him at God's feet, seeking his face. He didn't throw in the towel, and because of it, he was rewarded. His actions were met with this response. The messenger arrived to explain the details to Daniel, and then at the end of the messenger's speech about this vision, there's a little extra sneak peek that the messenger throws in for Daniel. He gets to see the finish line finally come into view. So the very last verse in the book of Daniel says, "As for you, go your way until the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance." That's pretty cool. So now, like I said earlier, the end of the race is the best part. You arrive at the finish line. Sweat is dripping down your face. Your muscles are screaming. But there's this surge of adrenaline and joy that literally rushes over you. You've finished. You've completed the course. And upon your arrival, there's this crowd that's cheering for you. And there's all kinds of delicious food to eat. A band is playing, and you get to dance and shout for joy. And then a race official walks up to you with a huge smile and places a huge medal around your neck. And they say, "Well done. You've done good." And for that one moment, all of the training and all of the running was worth it. So Daniel, he ran his race well. He started off as a boy that was taken from his home and then studied and served in the palace of kings. He experienced trials and checkpoints that tested his faith, his ability, and his trust in God. In each one, he showed this unshakable hope in the Lord. He may have come out of that race with some sweat, some blood, and some tears, but all of that was going to be worth it someday. Because he knew that if he kept pressing into God and running with endurance, he would receive the ultimate prize, something worth a whole lot more than this Wonder Woman medal. An eternal inheritance, one that would last forever, a home in heaven forever someday, when he gets to be with his Creator, see God face to face. When God would place the crown of righteousness on his head and say, "Well done, you've done good." Jake, you can come on up. I just wanted to share a personal story about a checkpoint that I experienced. Like checkpoint number 1 for Daniel, this one tested my source of strength. I grew up in a Christian home. I was about 23, still living in Bismarck, fresh out of college, and I had a degree to teach high school students. But God had recently called me to kids ministry, and so I was interning at my home church, Evangel, under an incredible kids pastor, and I loved every minute of it. It was so much fun. But 9 months into that internship, I learned that the kids pastor training me was called to another church. So Evangel came to me and they said, Kayla, we've watched you do this internship and we know that you know how to do everything. Will you be the interim kids director? Will you just keep the kids ministry ship running until we can hire an official kids pastor? And I wanted with all of my heart to do it. I was so excited and I was humbled at the thought that they would even ask me to do this. But I was also completely terrified. So one night I sat in the kids' auditorium at Evangel, and there's an altar in there, and I sat at the altar, and I kid you not, I ugly cried for a long time. I bawled my eyes out. But I also chose to pray. I said, God, I want to do this. And if you want me to do this, God, I will. But you have to give me the strength to do it. See, I've only been learning kids ministry for 9 months, and sure, I have a teaching degree, and I graduated at the top of my class, but these are kids. These are not high school students. And this is a ministry. This is not a school. And on top of that, I have no idea how to lead a ministry of 400 kids and the army of 200 leaders that it takes to run this kids ministry. God, I don't know what I'm doing. I absolutely cannot do this without you. And so clearly, this is probably the most clearly I have ever heard God's voice speak to me. He said, Kayla, you don't have to prove to anybody that you know what you're doing. You just have to show them that you trust me. And God was saying, allow me to lead. Allow me to be your source of strength. Don't do this on your own. Watch me move in the kids. Because he knew that I couldn't do it on my own. And he was waiting for me to realize that too. And to see if I would decide if I would do it in my own strength and fail, or if I would press into him and allow him to get all of the credit. So that's exactly what I did. I pressed in, and eventually I ended up being the kids pastor that Evangel hired. And I loved all 3 years that I was there. I watched God do incredible things in the lives of those kids and in the lives of the leaders that I got to serve with. In fact, I was so thankful for that moment when God tested my source of strength, because it allowed me to fully step into a calling that I love, and God strengthened my trust in him. Those words that God spoke to me that night have been the foundation of how I've served in kids ministry ever since. It's not by my strength, it's by his alone. So he gets all the glory. If I hadn't pressed into God that night, I would have missed the plan that God had for my life. I would have missed becoming a kids pastor. And I wouldn't be standing here on this stage to tell you about it today. I would have missed this opportunity to glorify God with part of my testimony. So now in this morning, each one of us here is like Daniel. We're in a race. And along the way, there will be different mile markers and tests. They'll look different for every one of us. Some will come from enemy attack, temptation, or simply because God wants to pull out your potential or push you out of your comfort zone. No matter what they look like, I can guarantee that your mile markers will test your faith, your source of strength, and your ability to trust God with your future. They will force you to make a decision. Will you press into the Lord like Daniel did, or will you forge your own path and run away from him? Because there's no middle ground. There's only towards him or away from him. Will you hold fast to what you know is true, or will you falter? Now, no one's perfect. We all make mistakes, and God is gracious and offers his forgiveness. But the choices that you make now will ultimately determine what kind of experience you have when you cross that finish line. And so my prayer for each of you today is that someday you can look back on the span of your life and say these words from 2 Timothy. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award for me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. So why don't you stand with me just for a second? Maybe you're here today and you're facing a checkpoint. Your faith is being tested, your strength is pushed to your limits, and you're in a spot where you just need to put your future in God's hands and trust him with it. Maybe God is pulling you out of your comfort zone. Well, guess what? Now is the time to press into him. We do this by digging deep into our prayer lives, by spending extended and intentional time with him, seeking his face, allowing him to speak to us, listening and responding, giving him the glory and positioning you yourself at his feet. Now maybe you're in here today and you're not facing a checkpoint. Life feels good. And you know what? That's fine. But let me tell you something. It is 100% guaranteed that another checkpoint is on its way in your life, and it will be unlike any other that you have experienced before. And another will follow that, and another will follow that, and another, until the day you die. And it is much easier to stand strong in trials if you've prepared yourself beforehand for what you will do in them than it is to figure it out while it's happening. Just like it's a lot more effective to train a kid what to do in case of a fire than it is to let them figure it out while the fire is literally blazing around them. So now is your time to rededicate and examine your heart and choose to press in once again, to choose prayer. The prayer team, if you want to come forward. Today, if you're choosing to press in, if you're saying, yes, God, I want to seek you. I want to seek your face. I choose you. I choose to focus on you alone. Then I'm asking you right now in this moment to come forward and do just that. To press in, to seek him. Position yourself at his feet. The altar's open. Regardless of whether you're at a checkpoint now or one is on its way. It's time to take the initiative because God is waiting for you to press into him.